The House of Quiet Hands, London, 1884. The city breathed smoke. Black clouds rolled above chimneys, carrying the smell of coal and wet stone. In the narrow streets, horse hooves clopped on cobblestones, while the cries of newspaper boys and the whistle of steam trains filled the air. Inside a tall brick townhouse on Grosvenor Street, the sound was different, quiet, heavy, almost fragile. The kind of quiet that could break under the smallest of human feelings. Edward Hargrave sat in the study, a fire burning low in the grate. He was a tall man in his late 30s, his hair neatly parted, his suit perfectly pressed. His face, though, carried something no tailor could smooth away, an ache in his eyes that came from years of holding back. Upstairs in the nursery, his daughter Clara was painting alone. She was 8 years old, with pale skin and golden brown hair that curled like ivy. Her cheeks were flushed from the warmth of the small fireplace, but her eyes held a question she could never quite ask. Edward could hear her faint, laughter whenever her paintbrush slipped, and every time he heard it, his hands twitched. It was a reflex, an instinct to go upstairs, to scoop her up, to spin her around like he did in the first weeks after her birth. But this was Victorian England. A father did not simply hug his child. It was not just custom, it was law in some households, an unwritten but fiercely guarded rule of conduct. Affection, especially from fathers, was considered indulgent. Too much of it, they said, would spoil the child, weaken their discipline, ruin their future. A Victorian father could shake his son's hand. He could pat his daughter's shoulder on her birthday, but to hold them, tightly, warmly, without permission, was a trespass against the code of the home. For Edward, it was worse. In the Hargrave household, the mother's word was law when it came to child rearing, and Lydia Hargrave believed in strict separation. A father's role was to provide, to ensure the family's name stayed respectable. Love, she said, was to be shown through duty, not touch. Yet, in Edward's heart, the rules felt like chains. The memory that would not fade it. Had been 5 years since that day in the hospital when Clara was burning with fever. The doctor had ordered her kept still, and Lydia had stood beside the bed with folded arms. Edward had knelt there, desperate to comfort her. He had taken her small, trembling hand in his, and Lydia had snapped, "Edward, do not coddle her. You will make her weak." That was the last time he had touched his daughter without asking permission, and permission rarely came. Still, every evening after returning from the factory offices, he found excuses to linger by the nursery door. "How is the painting coming along, my dear?" he would ask, his voice careful, polite. Clara would beam and show him her work, a clumsy, beautiful mess of colors, and he would smile, hiding the ache in his chest. Tonight was no different. He climbed the stairs, the wood creaking under his polished shoes. He paused at the doorway, leaning against the frame. Clara was sitting on the floor, humming to herself, her fingers stained with green paint. She looked up when she noticed him, her smile instant and wide. "Papa! Look, it's a meadow with a lake!" She held up the paper proudly. Edward stepped inside, his footsteps slow, his hands behind his back like a visitor in a gallery. "It's beautiful, Clara. You've captured the water perfectly." Clara tilted her head. "Do you think, maybe, the people in the painting should be hugging? Like when friends meet after a long time?" The question was innocent. But Edward's throat tightened. Children noticed more than adults believed. Clara had seen enough in her short life to know her father's hands never rested on her shoulders, never lifted her into the air, never wrapped her in warmth. He wanted to kneel beside her. He wanted to say, "Yes, my dear, and we will paint ourselves into this meadow, hugging forever." But Lydia's voice, sharp and cold, echoed in his mind. Lydia's rules downstairs. Lydia Hargrave was seated at the dining table, her back straight, her black silk gown shimmering faintly in the candlelight. She was going through a stack of invitations for the season's gatherings. When Edward descended, she didn't look up. "You didn't interfere in her bedtime, I trust?" Edward kept his tone neutral. "I spoke with her, admired her painting." "Good. You know the physician advised minimal physical indulgence. It weakens their resolve." Lydia's tone was final, as though she spoke of proven science. Edward bit the inside of his cheek. He wanted to say that resolve meant nothing to a lonely child, that affection was not a disease, that fathers had hearts too. But in this house, arguments were battles he rarely won. The letter. That night in his study, Edward pulled out a small leather-bound book. It was his private journal, hidden from Lydia. He opened to a fresh page and began to write. Not to himself, but to Clara. "My dear Clara, today I saw you painting again. You looked happy, though I wonder if you know how much I wish to hold you when you smile. One day, when you are older, I hope you will understand that a father's love can be silent but no less real. I am proud of you every day." He stopped, his pen trembling. He would keep writing these letters even if he could never give them to her now. What Edward didn't know was that a time was coming, sooner than he imagined, when rules, propriety, and silence would be tested. And in that moment, he would have to choose between the law of the house and the law of the heart. The hug that lived in dreams. It was a Sunday morning in late autumn. The air outside was a sheet of silver mist, damp enough to cling to the windows and blur the world beyond. London had its usual music, church bells ringing somewhere far off, the sound of wheels crunching over wet cobblestones, the faint cry of a bread seller pushing his cart down the lane. In the Hargrave household, Sundays were governed by ritual. Breakfast was served at 8 sharp, and attendance was mandatory. Lydia sat at the head of the table, her hands folded over a linen napkin, her dark hair pinned into a perfect knot. Edward sat to her right, Clara to her left, and between them stretched not only the gleaming length of polished mahogany but the invisible wall of Victorian manners. Clara spoke only when spoken to. She knew the rules. No elbows on the table, no childish giggles, no sudden stories that might break the quiet order Lydia demanded. Edward watched his daughter butter a slice of bread, the motion slow and precise. She was trying to be what her mother called a young lady of decorum, but Edward could see the flicker of impatience in her eyes. He had been 8 once, too, and he remembered the urge to run, to play, to be messy with joy. "A chance at warmth after breakfast," Lydia announced. She would be visiting her sister in Belgravia for the afternoon. She left the room with the faint rustle of silk, leaving Edward and Clara alone in the parlor. The absence of Lydia's presence was like the sudden lifting of a storm cloud. Clara looked at her father, and her lips curled into a tiny, almost secret smile. "Papa," she said softly, "will you come see my new book? The one with the adventure stories?" Edward's heart lifted. "Of course." They climbed to the nursery together. The air smelled faintly of lavender and chalk dust. Clara fetched a thick, worn book from her shelf and opened it on the floor, patting the spot beside her. Edward sat down, careful not to crowd her space, another habit born from years of restraint. She began to read aloud, her small voice carrying the tale of a brave sailor who crossed dangerous seas to bring gifts home to his family. Edward listened, but his eyes kept straying to her. How her hair fell across her cheek, how her little hands gripped the pages. Then she did something unexpected. She leaned sideways, just enough that her shoulder brushed against his. It was light, almost accidental, but it sent a wave of warmth through him that made his throat tighten. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. This was more than just contact. It was her choice. And yet a question still hung in the air. Did he dare respond? The dream that night, Edward dreamed of a meadow. It was filled with tall grass swaying in golden light, and Clara was running toward him, her arms outstretched. There was no Lydia, no rules, no cold shadows of the drawing room, only Clara's laughter and the weightless joy of lifting her into the air. He hugged her in that dream, spinning until the world became a blur. When he woke, the ache in his chest was sharper than ever. Dreams were cruel. They gave you what you most desired and then tore it away with the morning. A whisper in the dark. The next evening, rain tapped against the window panes. Edward was in his study when he heard the softest knock at the door. "Come in," he called. The door creaked open, and there stood Clara, barefoot in her nightgown, her eyes wide. "Papa, may I sit with you a little?" she whispered. Edward glanced toward the hallway, half expecting Lydia's sharp voice to call out, but the house was quiet. He nodded and held out a chair. Clara climbed up, folding her legs beneath her. "Papa," she said after a long pause, "do other fathers hug their daughters?" The question cut straight through him. His hands clenched on the armrests. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low. "Some do, in other homes." She tilted her head. "Then why don't you?" Edward swallowed hard. "Because, in our home, I must ask your mother's permission, and she believes it is better if we do not." Clara's brow furrowed in confusion. "But I think hugs make people stronger, not weaker." Her words were simple, but they shook him. Perhaps children saw truth more clearly than adults burdened with rules. The promise, Edward leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. "Clara, I cannot promise to break the rules, but I promise you this. One day I will give you the hug you deserve, and when I do, it will be worth every year we've waited." Clara smiled, a small, hopeful smile, and Edward stored that image deep in his heart, knowing he would carry it until the day came. What neither of them knew was that the day was already on its way. Pushed closer by events neither could stop. The day the rain wouldn't stop. By late November, London had fallen into its long season of wet. The rain did not come in fierce storms. It simply stayed, thin and cold, day after day, painting the sky in shades of iron. The cobblestones gleamed with water, the gutters gurgled softly, and the fog clung so thick that gas lamps burned as faint halos in the dark. In the Hargrave townhouse, the damp had crept into the walls. The windows fogged from the difference in temperature, and the constant hiss of rain on the roof filled every quiet space. Lydia, as always, kept the household running with military precision. Clara attended her lessons with Miss Penrose, the governess, in the morning, and in the afternoon she was allowed an hour of independent refinement, which meant quiet, reading, drawing, or embroidery. Edward had returned early from the factory office that day, his carriage wheels splashing through the shallow streams along the road. His umbrella dripped as he stepped inside, shaking off the cold. He wasn't sure why he had hurried home. It was as though something in him had wanted to be there before the evening shadows settled in. An unexpected message. The butler, Mr. Quinn, met him at the door. The older man's face was more tense than usual. "There's been word from the school, sir," Quinn said in a low voice. "Miss Clara took ill during her French lesson. Miss Penrose has sent for the physician. She is resting in the nursery now." Edward felt his chest tighten. "Ill? How ill?" "Not severe, sir. At least not yet. Fever and shivers." The rain caught her on the way back from church rehearsal this morning. Edward didn't wait for another word. He climbed the stairs two at a time, something he rarely did in this house. The child in the chair. The nursery smelled faintly of camphor and lavender. Clara sat in a cushioned chair by the fire, her small body wrapped in a blanket, her cheeks pale except for the two bright spots of fever on them. She looked up when her father entered, her lips parting in surprise. "Papa!" she said, her voice soft but glad. Edward crossed the room quickly, but then, almost by instinct, he stopped, short, just out of reach. That invisible wall still stood between them. "How do you feel, my dear?" he asked gently. "Cold." "But my head feels hot," she murmured. He wanted to kneel and press his hand to her forehead. He wanted to lift her onto his lap the way he'd seen other fathers do in the park, wrapping their coats around their children. But Lydia's rules wrapped tighter than any blanket. Lydia's entrance. The door opened, and Lydia stepped in, her black skirts brushing the carpet. She carried a small glass bottle and a teaspoon. "The doctor will arrive shortly," she said briskly. Until then, quinine should help. Edward stood back as Lydia spooned the bitter medicine into Clara's mouth. She did it without softness, without even a comforting word afterward, only a reminder to swallow. Clara obeyed, her expression quiet, but Edward saw the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. After Lydia left, Edward stayed, talking to Clara about the meadow she had painted, about how winter frost would make the grass sparkle like glass. She smiled faintly, but her eyelids drooped. The letter. He shouldn't write. That night, Edward returned to his study and opened his journal again. He began another letter to Clara, this one longer, filled with all the words he could never say aloud in Lydia's presence. "My Clara, today you were unwell, and I stood only a step away from you. I wanted nothing more than to lift you, to hold you until the fever left. But the rules kept me still. I fear these rules will one day steal from us the closeness we were meant to have. But hear me. There is no law, no custom, no cold hand of society that can truly keep a father's heart from his child." He closed the book with more force than usual. Something in him had begun to shift. The storm that changed everything. 2 nights later, the rain turned violent. Wind rattled the shutters, and the gutters overflowed. Edward had just finished supper when Quinn appeared again, looking anxious. "Sir, Miss Clara has been calling for you." Edward didn't wait for permission. He went straight to the nursery. Clara was in bed now, the fever worse, her small body tossing restlessly under the covers. Her hair clung damp to her forehead, and her lips whispered half-formed words, one of them his name. Edward's hands shook. He couldn't just stand there this time. The weight of years of silence and restraint pressed down on him, and for the first time in years, he stepped forward. He sat on the edge of her bed, brushing her hair back gently. Her eyes fluttered, open, and for a moment they were filled with recognition and relief. "Papa," she whispered. Edward's hand lingered on her cheek. He didn't care if Lydia walked in. He didn't care if the entire Victorian code of conduct came crashing down on him. Clara was sick, and she needed warmth, not rules. That night was the first crack in the wall between them. But soon, something would happen that would shatter it entirely. The night the rules died. The fever did not break. 3 days had passed since the storm, and the house had slipped into a strange rhythm. Footsteps hushed in the halls, whispers exchanged outside the nursery door, the occasional creak of the stairs when someone brought hot water or medicine. Even Lydia, usually a fortress of control, had started to show signs of strain. Edward had not left Clara's side for long. He came home early from the factory, telling his clerk that urgent domestic matters required him. He sat in the nursery for hours, reading aloud from her favorite books, speaking to her even when she drifted in and out of sleep. Every so often her small hand would twitch, and he would fight the urge to take it fully into his own. A visit from Dr. Whitcomb on. The fourth evening, Dr. Whitcomb arrived, a tall, thin man with iron-gray whiskers and a bag that smelled of leather and antiseptic. He examined Clara in silence, his brow furrowing. "She has influenza," the doctor said finally, turning to Lydia and Edward. "The fever is high, but her breathing is the greater concern. We must keep her warm, and she must be given broth and cordial regularly." Lydia's lips tightened. "And what of rest? Should she not be left undisturbed?" Whitcomb shook his head. "Comfort is as important as rest. The child's mind must be soothed if the body is to heal. If she seeks company, she should have it, especially from her parents." Edward felt something inside him shift. That was the first time in years anyone had given him permission, and this time it didn't come from Lydia. The collapse. That night, as the rain softened into a quiet drizzle, Edward stepped into the nursery again. Clara was pale as ivory, her lips dry, her hair damp against the pillow. She stirred when he approached. "Papa?" she whispered, her voice so faint he barely heard it. "I'm here, my dear," he said, pulling the chair closer. Her eyes met his, and there was fear in them, the kind of fear no child should carry. "I had a bad dream," she said. "I was in a cold place and I couldn't find you." That was the moment the rules died. Edward didn't ask permission. He didn't think about Lydia. He simply reached forward, slid his arms beneath her, and lifted her gently from the bed. Clara's head rested against his shoulder as though it had been waiting there for years. She was light, too light, and he could feel the fever burning through her nightgown. But her small hands clung to his coat, and he knew he had done the only right thing. Lydia walks. The door opened suddenly. Lydia stood in the doorway, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and anger. "Edward," she hissed, "what are you doing?" "Holding my daughter," he said calmly, his voice low but steady. "You'll coddle her into weakness. She is sick, Lydia. She needs her father. And I will not stand here while she suffers for the sake of your rules." It was the first time Edward had spoken to her in that tone. Lydia's lips pressed together, and for a moment Edward thought she might explode. But instead, she turned and left, the click of her heels sharp against the hall floor. The hug that broke the fever. Edward stayed like that for nearly an hour, rocking her gently in the dim light, whispering quiet stories about meadows and summer. Days. Slowly, her breathing steadied. The tightness in her face eased. By dawn, the fever had begun to lower. When Clara finally opened her eyes fully, she whispered, "Papa, you're warm." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "And so are you, my dear." For the first time in years, Edward felt whole. It was as though one simple hug had undone years of silence. But he knew Lydia would not let this pass quietly. The real battle was only beginning. The letter that changed everything. The winter in London deepened. Frost silvered the rooftops each morning, and the breath of horses hung in the air like ghostly steam. Coal smoke drifted low through the streets, curling into the narrow lanes. The Hargrave townhouse stood as it always had, red brick, polished brass, windows like watchful eyes. But inside, the mood had shifted in ways Lydia could not control. Edward's quiet rebellion on that stormy night had not been forgotten. Clara's fever had broken and her recovery was steady. But in Lydia's mind, Edward's actions were still a breach of decorum, of her authority, of the invisible rules that governed their home. Lydia's ultimatum one evening, when the lamps were lit and the parlor smelled faintly of the wood fire, Lydia called Edward in. She was seated upright, her gloved hands resting in her lap. "Edward," she began, her voice measured, "we must address the incident." He sat opposite her, his expression calm but unyielding. "If you mean the night I held our daughter, there's nothing to address. She was ill. She needed comfort." Lydia's eyes narrowed. "You risked undoing years of discipline. You risked teaching her that she may demand affection whenever she pleases." "She didn't demand anything," Edward said evenly. "She needed me, and I will not apologize for being there." The silence between them was like ice. Lydia's mouth tightened. "Then understand this. If you insist on such displays, you will do so knowing you undermine me in my own home." Edward met her gaze steadily. "If the price of being a father is to undermine that kind of rule, then so be it." Clara's secret notebook. Unbeknownst to either of them, Clara had begun keeping a small notebook of her own. In it, she wrote short lines about her days, about the meadow in her imagination, about the stories Papa told her when Mama wasn't, near about the warmth of that hug during her fever. She drew 2 stick figures in one corner, one tall, one small, standing under a tree, their arms around each other. Beneath it, she had written in clumsy letters, "Best day." The letter from Yorkett was on a cold afternoon in late February when the letter came. The butler, Mr. Quinn, brought it to Edward in his study. The paper was thick, sealed with dark red wax. The handwriting was formal. Edward broke the seal and read, "Sir, it is with respect that I write to you. I am Reverend Charles Mayhew of St. Peter's Parish in York. Your daughter Clara recently sent a small story to our church's children's publication. In it she wrote of a father who was not allowed to hug his child until one day he did. The story moved our congregation deeply. I believe you should know. Your daughter's words have already reached more hearts than you can imagine." Edward's breath caught. He read it twice. The letter enclosed a small clipping from the parish newsletter, and there it was. Clara's simple, heartfelt story, printed for others to see. Lydia reads it. To that evening, Lydia found the clipping on Edward's desk. She read it in silence. Her face did not change much, but there was a flicker, small, almost imperceptible, in her eyes. "She sent this herself?" Lydia asked. "She did," Edward replied. Lydia put the paper down slowly. "It is very plainly written." "It's the truth," Edward said. For the first time in years, Lydia didn't respond with a sharp retort. Instead, she turned away, her posture unusually still. A quiet shift. Over the following weeks, Clara began to receive letters, small notes from strangers, thanking her for her story. Some were from other children, others from adults who admitted they had not hugged their fathers in years. Edward noticed something else, too. Lydia stopped interrupting him when he lingered in the nursery. She still did not openly encourage his affection, but she no longer stepped in with that sharp tone to stop it. The hug in the street. One afternoon, as the family walked home from church, Clara tripped on the uneven pavement. Edward caught her, before she fell, lifting her instinctively into his arms. They were in public, in full view of the Sunday crowd. In the old days, Lydia would have frozen with disapproval. But this time, she said nothing. She only walked beside them, her face unreadable. Clara looped her arms around her father's neck, resting her head against his shoulder, and Edward realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just in their home, but in the air around them. The day the door stayed open. Spring came to London quietly that year. It did not burst in with bright blue skies and warm breezes, but crept gently, softening the air, coaxing pale blossoms onto the bare branches along Grosvenor Street. The city smelled faintly of damp earth instead of coal smoke, and the sound of children's voices began to return to the parks. In the Hargrave household, change had been slower, quieter, but no less real. Edward and Clara's bond was no longer a secret. There were still moments when Lydia's gaze was cool, still mornings when she corrected Clara's posture with a firm hand, But there were also pauses, moments when Lydia seemed to stop herself from saying something as if rethinking old habits, an invitation. One morning, the post arrived with an envelope addressed to Miss Clara Hargrave. The handwriting was neat, the paper pale cream. Clara tore it open with eager fingers. "Papa, it's from Reverend Mayhew," she said, eyes wide. The letter invited Clara and her family to York for a small gathering. The parish wanted to meet the young girl whose story had touched so many. They also planned to present her with a bound copy of her story, illustrated by the parish school children. Edward looked to Lydia, waiting for her to dismiss the idea as impractical or improper. But instead, Lydia read the letter slowly and said, "It seems respectable enough." It was the closest she had ever come to approval. The journey. The trip to York was long, by carriage to the station, then hours on the train through the green and brown quilt of the countryside. Clara sat beside her father, chattering about how she imagined the church would look. Edward listened with quiet joy, remembering how, months ago, she would have spoken so carefully in public. Lydia sat opposite them, her gloved hands folded, but now and then Edward caught her watching the two of them. Not with disapproval, but with something more complicated, the gathering sacks. Peter's parish was a modest stone church, its stained glass windows catching the pale afternoon light. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the scent of beeswax polish. A small crowd had gathered, children in simple Sunday clothes, elderly, parishioners leaning on canes, young mothers with babies in their arms. Reverend Mayhew greeted them with a broad smile. "Miss Hargrave, we are honored." Clara blushed as he led her to the front, where a table held the bound copy of her story. Its cover was embossed with her name. When she opened it, she saw delicate illustrations of a tall man and a little girl standing in a meadow, the father's arms around his daughter. Edward swallowed hard. It was exactly the image he had carried in his mind all those years. The speech reverend. Mayhew cleared his throat. This story, though written by a child, reminds us of something essential, that love is not weakness, and that a father's embrace can be the very strength a child carries for life. In our time, some customs may keep us from showing affection, but perhaps we should ask, what do we lose when we obey those customs too strictly? The words hung in the air. Edward saw several fathers in the crowd shift uncomfortably, as though the truth had found them where they stood. Lydia's eyes were fixed on Clara, and Edward could not read her expression. The moment after the ceremony, a little boy from the parish tugged on Edward's sleeve. "Mister," he said shyly, "in your daughter's story, the papa hugs her even though he's not supposed to. Is that you?" Edward smiled gently. "Yes, lad. That's me." The boy grinned, then turned to his own father. "Can I have a hug, Papa?" Something in Edward's chest tightened as he watched the man hesitate, then kneel, wrap his arms around his son, and hold him close. The walk home. That night, back at the inn, Clara fell asleep quickly, her head resting against Edward's arm, as they sat by the fire. Lydia was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "Edward, when you held her that night, during her fever, I was angry, but I've been thinking. Perhaps I was wrong." Edward looked at her in surprise. "I was raised to believe affection spoiled children," Lydia continued, "but I've seen how she looks at you now. She is happier." Edward said nothing, letting the moment breathe. Lydia's gaze dropped to Clara's sleeping face. "I don't want to be the reason she grows up thinking her parents kept their hearts locked away." The door that stayed open. From that night on, there were no more permissions to ask. No formalities to observe before a father could place his hands on his child's shoulders or lift her high in joy. In the Hargrave home, the nursery door no longer marked a boundary Edward had to hover outside. It stayed open, and Clara, growing taller with each passing season, never had to wonder again if she could run into her father's arms. Years later, when Clara herself became a mother, she told her own children the story, not just of the night her father broke the rules, but of the day the rules broke forever. And in the telling, the hugs passed on, unmeasured, unpermitted, and utterly free.